of our This is the second of our webinars. Just to mention, it is being recorded, so if you don't want to be seen, feel free to turn your camera off. Just for those who don't know, Living Out is a group that was set up 10 years or so ago, a group of Christian leaders who experience same-sex attraction, committed to living out a biblically orthodox lifestyle with marriage being between a man and a woman. And I say this is our second webinar. So Ed Shaw, our ministry director, did something on pastoral care for those who are gay, same-sex attracted last autumn. And this year this time we've got Andrew Bunt, who's our emerging generations director, who's going to speak about the issue of trans identification amongst teens. So let me explain how the event's going to work. In a minute or two, I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to speak for about 25 minutes or so. And then after that, there'll be time for questions. So the way we're going to do questions is we're going to use Slido for those who, some of you may be aware of Slido, others less so. So if you Google Slido, S-L-I-D-O, and then there's a code, LO webinar is the sort of code you need. So LO is in living out webinar, or Dan's just added in chats the sort of web address to find that there. So so I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to talk through trans identification amongst teens. So let's pray, shall we? Father God, we want to thank you so much that we're those who are made in your image and given great dignity and great worth. As Lord, as we think about trans identification amongst teens, we're conscious that we're talking about those who are precious, those who are valuable. Maybe in many of our cases, people that we know in our churches and local communities. So Father, please help us. We want to be wise, we want to be godly, we want to love people well. So equip Andrew, and may you use him to equip the rest of us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Andrew, can I hand over to you?
Thanks so much. Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today to think together about this topic. We've only got an hour to talk about a very big, very complex, very important topic, but I hope that it will be a helpful starting point, at least for many of us. One of the things I'll do, and certainly you might find that a handout you received an email before the event, is further resources you want to go further as well. Because this is a hugely complex topic, a topic which you might well be aware is kind of highly debated in wider society at the moment. But perhaps even more importantly, it's a topic that's impacting so many young people, including so many young people whom you and I will know and love and have the privilege of serving, whether that be in church context or other contexts. And I'm really convinced that actually what we're seeing among teenagers at the moment in terms of trans identification is a great moment of opportunity for the church, opportunity to love young people well, an opportunity to bring some of the good news of the Bible and the good news of the gospel to young people. And what I want to do with a little bit of time we've got today is just to talk through together, or to look at three key questions that I think brief answers to them give us a good starting point, I guess, of understanding this topic and understanding how we as churches, whether that be church leaders or youth leaders, might engage well. So we're going to start with the question, what's actually going on when we talk about this topic of trans identification among teens? You're probably already aware that there has been a huge increase in the numbers of young people, especially teenagers, that is, who are identifying as transgender in some way or are questioning their gender identity. And maybe it's worth actually first just kind of clarifying, what do we mean by the term transgender and this nice whole topic of gender identity? Trans, you may or may not be aware, is a very broad term, kind of what we could call an umbrella term, used to cover a whole range of experiences, but at their core, the kind of unifying feature of all of these experiences is a person experiencing some form of or some level of disconnect between what their body seems to say, so their biological sex, and what their internal sense of self seems to say, what's often called gender identity. And trans is this broad umbrella term for a whole range of different experiences of some level of disconnect or a tension between what the body is saying and what the internal self is saying. And so some young people might identify as trans, or some might identify with many of the other different gender identities that are kind of being talked about these days. Many young people identifying as non-binary, for example, saying that their internal sense of self, they don't feel they are a man or a woman. They fit somewhere in between, or a fluid identity, such as gender fluid. Many young people say, actually, I'm not sure that each day I feel the same in terms of who I am inside. And different days I might feel more masculine, or another day more feminine. All of these, though, fall under that broad umbrella of transgender. And so we're seeing, particularly in the last kind of decade or just over a decade now, a huge increase in the numbers of young people identifying as trans and wrestling with who do they feel themselves to be inside. One place we can see that in kind of hard numbers is in referrals to GIDS, the Gender Identity Development Service. That's the NHS clinic for under 18s questioning their gender. Back in 2011 through to 2012, so about 11 years ago now, there were just 210 referrals to GIDS in that year. Last year, 2021 to 2022, there were over 5,000 referrals to GIDS. So in just about 11 years, that's more than 2,300% increase in the numbers of young people seeking that kind of help. That, of course, probably is just in a sense the top level, and there'll be many more who don't get referred and aren't seeking professional help in that way. And certainly, in addition to those hard numbers, we'll probably all know anecdotally from our work with young people how common this is becoming. Anyone working with young people in school context or a community context or a church context will be aware of how many young people are in different ways questioning their gender identity. But if we're asking what's going on, we also need to note two other things. One is that we're not just seeing an increase in the numbers of young people identifying as trans, we're also seeing a change in the type of young person identifying as trans and seeking help for that. Again, if we look at the stats from GIDS, this is particularly prominent and present or kind of observable. So historically, before about 10 years ago, it was vast majority boys pre-puberty, so boys in childhood who were seeking help from GIDS and questioning their gender identity. Now we're seeing vast majority teenage girls. So it's changed from boys to girls and changed from childhood into adolescence into teenage years. And that's a significant change that needs to be kind of thought about. Another thing that should be said in terms of what's happening is that this kind of cohort, this group of young people identifying as trans are in many ways not representative of the wider population, in the sense that there are many things that are more common among this group of young people than among young people in more general terms. So again, stats from GIDS and other gender clinics around the world would show us this. Things like among the young people identifying as trans, pre-existing mental health diagnoses are much more common. Autism and ASD characteristics are much more common. In the general population, autism is about 1 or 2% of people impacted. In the referrals to GIDS, it's about a whole third, it's about 33%. Some estimates are actually almost 50%. A huge difference there between this group of young people questioning their gender and the broader kind of population of young people. There's also things people notice, like there's a high proportion of people being referred who have been in the social care system, looked after children. Many have been questioning their sexuality before they question their gender identity. And just in lots of ways, this group of young people aren't reflective, statistically speaking, to the wider population. And so that's kind of a what's going on thing. Some of this the bare bones of things we may have observed ourselves, and certainly as we look at some of the evidence from someone like GIDS, we see, which then should rightly raise the question of why is this happening? Anyone who cares about young people should be caring about what's going on, in a sense, asking why is this happening? And in a really good way, lots of people have really started to answer and to wrestle with that question. And the reason the why is it happening question is so important is that's going to help us think about how might we help young people who are questioning their gender identity and living in this context where many young people are. Understanding or getting a sense of what's going on and why it's happening is going to help us think about response. And broadly speaking, then, there are two explanations, what I call two different perspectives, which I think capture the kind of main views on what is going on. And these two different perspectives then shape and feed into two really quite different approaches to helping young people. And it's very worthwhile being aware of both of these perspectives, that both of them are at work, and wrestling of which one might be most helpful to us. And so one common perspective in our culture is what I dub the diversity perspective. And this perspective basically just says that what we're seeing here, this increase in trans identification, is actually just the natural kind of variation in humanity becoming more visible. The kind of idea goes that modern Western culture is a place we can be honest about who we are. And that's all that is happening, is that the natural variation that's always been there in humanity is now more visible because people have the freedom to express themselves, the freedom to be honest about who they are. And this kind of concept, the diversity perspective, rests quite heavily on something known as gender identity theory. An idea that every one of us has this internal innate thing called a gender identity, that it's kind of something we're born with, it's core to us, and that reveals who we really are. And so on gender identity theory, our bodies aren't that important. They don't reveal to us whether we're a man or a woman. Actually, it's our internal gender identity that does. And so under this kind of theory, some men have female bodies and some women have male bodies, and some people aren't men or women because actually their internal gender identity falls somewhere within a spectrum between the two. And this diversity perspective, rooted in gender identity theory, then gives rise to what we might call the affirming approach in terms of how we might help young people. And this approach basically says people, including young people, are who they say they are and who they feel themselves to be. And so when a young person identifies as trans, this approach would say it's our job to accept that and to help them to affirm who they feel themselves to be, which might be through kind of social or medical or even eventually surgical transition. And this is the approach that's really prominent among influencers. This is what young people are hearing online. Go onto YouTube, to TikTok, to Reddit. A lot of the discussions around trans will be this kind of perspective. It's who you feel yourselves to be inside. That's who you really are. And we all need to do everything we can to help you express that and embrace that. It's also the perspective that's very common among the big kind of LGBT charities. And then they have for many years now had quite a lot of influence in schools. So many schools actually will be communicating and encouraging this kind of idea as well, often using materials from LGBT charities. And arguably, in some ways, it's the perspective which, at least in some areas, has been quite influential in GIDS in the NHS practice up until this point, although that is changing and about to change, as I'll explain. So this is a really common view. It underpins one of the common approaches to how we might respond to trans-identifying teens. But I think it also really struggles to account for a lot of the evidence that we've got there. You see, if all that is happening is we just become more tolerant as a society, so the natural variation in humanity is becoming more evident, we have to ask, well, why is it we're only seeing this variation predominantly among teenage girls? Why are we not seeing it among all teenagers? And actually, why not among all generations? Why are there so many teenage girls coming out as trans and not loads of middle-aged women coming out as trans? You just can't really account for the fact that this isn't a across the population kind of thing we're seeing. This perspective also really struggles to account for the fact that I talked about this group of young people are in many ways not representative of the general population. It can't account for the high rates of mental health diagnoses, of ASD characteristics, of same-sex attraction, of children who've been in the social care system. It doesn't seem to offer us answers to actually the kind of hard evidence of the group of people we're talking about. And a final significant problem, I think, here actually is this perspective doesn't help us to account for the perspectives of or the stories of detransitioners. Detransitioners are people who identified as trans and transitioned. They moved to live in line of who they felt themselves to be inside, rather than what their body said. But they now look back a number of years later and realize that actually there were other things going on. Their big thing actually wasn't about gender. Actually, there were mental health things, or there was trauma impacting them, or an experience of sexuality, or sometimes just very restrictive gender stereotypes were shaping their sense of self. And they look back now and said, actually, they were never trans in that sense, and that transitioning wasn't the right thing for them. One of the problems with the diversity perspective is it can't really account for those stories, and it can't help us work out how would we know who would and wouldn't detransition in the future. It doesn't give us a good way actually of caring for young people. So it's worth considering a different perspective. A different perspective is what I kind of dub the distress perspective. And the alternative perspective here, this basically says that transgender seems to have become the available explanation for teenage distress. and that the idea of transitioning has become kind of the promised solution given to young people to escape from and to solve their distress. So this perspective would start from the observation of the fact that many of those common factors I've mentioned a few times are potential causes of distress. Mental health conditions, autistic traits which make a young person feel they don't really fit in, same-sex attraction, it might make a young person feel uncomfortable, all sorts of different things, traumatic experiences, all of these are things that can cause distress. And there's a simple fact that probably all of us can relate to and remember that teenage years, for most of us, are in some ways quite distressing. None of us tend to find our teenage years easy. And I think it is fair to say it's probably harder to be a teenager today than it was for any of us when we were teenagers. That's one observation that kind of points in this direction. There's also a fact that we just know that ideas are contagious. There's lots of good peer-reviewed research shows ideas can be contagious. We know that's especially true among teenagers. And actually, we do know from research that's especially true among teenage girls. We've seen it in the past with things like anorexia, with things like self-harm, where these ideas and practices seem to become contagious in certain social settings and friendship groups and such like. And certainly the stories of trans teens and increasingly the research would suggest that friendship groups and also internet influences are often really key before a young person identifies as trans. You can get a friendship group where multiple young people in a short space of time are identifying as trans. Sometimes you get it in a town, there's one school where suddenly that becomes, in a sense, the hotbed of trans identification among young people. It then spreads out, but it all starts in a locality that might suggest there's a peer influence there. And certainly the vast majority of trans teen stories you might hear, the internet is very prominent. And there are studies that show that often internet usage goes up just before a young person comes out as trans. It seems quite plausible that there's a sense of a contagious idea and a strong influences impacting young people. And I think this distress perspective offers us a very good and plausible explanation of the situation we're seeing. This would explain why you're seeing this shift from pre-puberty boys to teenage girls, and why it's not women of all ages who are suddenly in vast numbers identifying as trans. We know that teenagers are particularly susceptible to contagious ideas, or social contagion as it's sometimes called. We know that teenage years are particularly distressing. There are lots of reasons, sadly, why particularly perhaps girls who are in teenage years at the moment might find life distressing. It makes sense that this narrative would be incredibly appealing to them. Also, I think, as I intimated, explaining some of those common features, actually, which are often things that cause distress. Why are these common features so common among this cohort of young people? Well, it could be because actually what it is, it's distressed young people reaching for an explanation of and a solution to their distress. This also had the strength of drawing on recognized scientifically established phenomenon, the idea of social contagion, in contrast to the diversity perspective, which relies on gender identity theory, which is not a scientific theory by kind of any measure. There's no scientific basis to the concept of gender identity. There's no study or no test you can do, no scan you can do to isolate gender identity. It's really a philosophical theory rooted in some people's personal experience rather than anything proven or anything scientific. And this distress perspective as well fits the common pattern of trans teen stories. Very often the story is kind of, I always knew there was something not quite right. I always knew I didn't quite fit in. And then I heard about trans. I heard this YouTuber, or I found this Reddit chat room, and suddenly I realized that's me and that explains it all. And then they told me, actually, if I stop puberty and if I take hormones, if I chop off my breasts, I'll feel wonderful. All my problems will go away. I've yet to hear really a trans teen story that doesn't fit that general pattern. And I've heard a lot of them. It just seems to me that this distress perspective maps onto the experiences that young people are describing quite closely. And it fits the stories of detransitioners. Detransitioners saying trans was such an appealing explanation for the distress I was experiencing. But actually now, a number of years later, these people are looking back saying, I now recognize my distress actually was caused by something else. So I think there's lots of kind of just reasonable reasons to think that this is a convincing explanation of what's going on. And then also Christians, we want to note that it fits with a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, a worldview that says that our bodies are a gift to us from God. Our bodies are a good thing. They are part of our true self. and the biblical teaching which says that to be a man or a woman is an identity given to us by God in our body. I think Genesis 1 is really clearly trying to show us this. Genesis 1, you get Genesis 1:27, that verse about male and female, he made them. And the very next verse, you get the command to procreate, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Why does the creation of male and female flow immediately into the command to procreate? It's because to be male or female, to be a man or woman, is to have a body that's structured to play one of two roles in reproduction. It's a received identity to be man or woman, given to us by God in the body we receive. It makes sense that it's our bodies who tell us who we are, not what we feel inside. And that's why scripture, I think, calls us to live out the identity God has given us in our body. This view kind of resonates with Christian teaching, and also resonates with the Christian teaching of the reality that we live in a world that's marred by sin. Every single one of us in different ways, at different times in our life, will experience distress. That's a normal part of life in a broken world. And also, because the world is marred by sin, we know that our feelings and what we find inside our instincts are not always reliable. Actually, embracing those, following those is not always the best thing for us. In a sense, our desires and our feelings can lie to us about both reality and also about what is best for us. All of this, it seems to me, means that a Christian perspective as well maps well onto this distress perspective of what is going on. And so this is an alternative perspective, and it gives us a very alternative approach to how we might help young people, and an approach that increasingly I think many young people are supporting and encouraging. A distress perspective leads to the kind of approach that says, actually, we need to focus on the deeper causes, the deeper things going on in a young person's life, not on gender questioning. That actually gender questioning is so often a surface symptom of other things, and we need to help young people by looking at the roots rather than looking at the surface symptoms, rather than look at the shoots in this sense. People who take this perspective would often be strongly discouraging any sort of significant intervention in terms of transitioning, including social transitioning, names and pronouns and such like, because actually that is in a sense just putting a plaster on something that isn't really the issue and not dealing with the deeper cause, the deeper problem. And this perspective would lead us to take an approach of trying to help young people be rooted in the real world, be rooted in their bodies, be rooted in reality in a sense, rather than in a narrative that is offering an escape from reality, which for so many young people is, I think, what transgender often easily becomes. And this kind of approach, which would flow out as something like the distress perspective, is basically the approach the NHS is now in the process of moving towards. You may or may not have heard that the NHS is doing a thorough review of their services for under 18s questioning their gender identity, something called the Cass review. Hilary Cass is a respected paediatrician. And on the basis of the interim report of that, so it's only halfway through, but on the basis just of the interim report, they are closing GIDS, the existing gender identity clinic, and opening regional centres under a new specification, a new way of working. And those proposals basically show they are shifting from a largely affirming perspective, largely saying, yes, you probably are who you say you are, and we probably will quite quickly help you to transition socially and medically. Actually, they're moving to a largely non-affirming perspective, for want of a better term, where actually even social transition, so even names and pronouns, how one dresses and stuff, will only be kind of facilitated or encouraged in very rare cases. The language is in when there is clinically significant distress or where there's impairment of social functioning. So the default will be not to help young people transition through the NHS. And actually the strong focus is going to become, we need to think about all these other things these young people are experiencing: mental health, ASD, questions around sexuality, traumatic experiences, all manner of different things. That's where we should be helping people. And so in many ways, the NHS is moving towards something underpinned by something like the distress perspective. They haven't come out and they won't come out and say they believe in something like the distress perspective, but their clinical approach certainly is changing towards that. And the final thing here, we are awaiting new guidance for schools. The changes in the NHS mean they have to update the school guidance, which has been very different. If it follows all the stuff that's going on in the NHS, it should be quite good in terms of safeguarding young people and just giving them good stuff. And it might well be really helpful to churches and to youth groups. So do keep your ears open for when new trans guidance is offered to schools. The likelihood is that I'll write something on that for Living Out at that time as well. So that might be some wisdom we as churches can take hold of there. Last question to ask then, just before we're opening up to Q&A, is how might we respond? This is what's going on. You've heard what I think is the kind of why it's happening at this distress perspective seems to be the best explanation, which leads us to a certain approach. What does that mean for people like you and me, who might be youth leaders, church pastors, just people who want to know and love teenagers and people in our churches? How might we respond? Just a few headlines here, really. Thinking just how we might respond in the cases of individuals. This, I think, in a sense, is the most difficult question for people in our positions. I really do think that the primary support for trans-identifying teens needs to come through parents. And the primary way we can help, actually, is through parents and to work with parents where they're possible. I know there can be all sorts of reasons why that's difficult or not always possible, but where that is possible, I think that's the key thing. And a role that we can play is to help parents to understand what might be going on. So many people just haven't heard the kind of perspectives we're talking about today. Help parents to think about the kind of influences their young people are being exposed to. What's being said at school, what's being accessed on the internet, stuff like that. And help parents to access good information and good support, including support groups. So on the handout, there's various kind of resources mentioned there. We've got some resources that are specifically aimed at parents. A quick guide called Gender Identity and Trans Identification for Parents, I co-authored originally for the Christian Medical Fellowship with a paediatrician friend, Julie Maxwell. An expanded version of this talk, actually, Transgender, an Introduction for Parents and Youth Leaders. And an article from my friend just mentioned there, Julie Maxwell, on parenting a child questioning their gender identity. All of those would be great starting points for us to point parents to. But then also there's loads of great groups, mostly secular groups, doing brilliant work on this as well. People like Transgender Trends, who are UK-based. Bayswater Support is the main parent support group in the UK for parents of trans-identifying kids. And many people find them really helpful, and so certainly are worth linking up people with. And GenSpect, which is an American organization who, if you're in the States, are particularly good to link to, and they have links to support groups internationally and might be worth pointing parents to. Ideally, I think when it comes to decisions about things like names and pronouns in the context of church, I think that works best in conversation with parents and us partnering with them with the kind of approach that they're taking. We can unpack that a bit more in Q&A if we want to. That's kind of on the individual level. And there's a few practical things for us on the kind of church level or youth group level. Three things I think are helpful to think about. I think we need to think about suffering. If what is going on is often about distress and young people trying to deal with distress, then we need to offer young people better ways of dealing with distress. We want our churches and our youth groups to be places of honesty, where young people can be honest about how they're feeling, what they're facing, how life is. We as leaders want to kind of lead by example in that, in appropriate ways, showing that it's safe to be honest. It's safe to ask questions. It's even a safe space to disagree with each other, but still to have relationship and be navigating things together. And I think it's so important that we talk to our young people about suffering, that suffering is a reality in human life, including in the Christian life, that the scriptures don't speak of suffering as something to be avoided at all costs, which of course is totally the narrative of our culture. We are a kind of anti-suffering culture in the sense of we expect we have the right to not suffer, and we expect pretty much any suffering we experience to be quickly solvable and so that we can quickly escape from. That's just not realistic. It's certainly not biblical. Actually asking not how do we escape from suffering all the time, but how do we handle experiences of suffering well? And how does the Bible help us to do that? Talking with young people about themes like lament, about the Bible's big story, its power to explain the roots of suffering, but also the promise of an end to suffering, the power of friendship, relationship with others, and the relationship with God when it comes to suffering. And so we're equipping young people not to feel the need to run after a cultural narrative offering what I would say is a fake solution to distress, but actually what does God say about how we navigate these experiences? So suffering, we also want to think about community. For so many young people, trans is related to community. Identifying as trans is a doorway into a community, often primarily an online community, and many young people kind of fall more and more into an online world, less and less in the real non-virtual world, as it were. And so many young people talk about the trans online community being a place they can feel accepted, a place they can be themselves, a place they can ask big questions and feel at home and feel they belong. And if that's what young people are looking for and receiving there, we need to offer a better experience of community to these young people. We want our churches, our youth groups to offer young people a deeper sense of belonging, a sense of, oh, I can come and just be myself. I can come and ask all the biggest, most complex or most embarrassing or whatever it might be questions that I have. And I think it's just so key for us as churches to both encourage and facilitate good community and good in-person, not online, friendships between young people. And I think it's probably always been the case, but I think there's never been a time, in my life at least, where kind of just the social side of a church youth group is so vitally important. It is not wasted time just to do things that help young people to build their friendships with each other, particularly, especially when that is in-person kind of stuff, because community is what young people are desperately looking for, like most of us as humans. And actually, we want to provide a better context for that than actually the kind of online world and unhelpful messages they might receive there. And I think obviously this becomes part of helping people to navigate suffering. Any of us who've experienced any level of suffering will know community and friendship are so vital in that. And then the final practical thing I think we can do as churches, as youth groups, is to think about foundations. Actually to think about laying the vital foundations that help young people to embrace and live out a biblical worldview and way of living. And I'm becoming more and more convinced that actually these are the more important things for us to talk to young people about, and the more helpful strategy for us to engage directly with young people rather than talking about the topic of gender directly and explicitly. These foundations are what makes sense of what the Bible does say on a topic like this. And so for quick examples, talking about identity, helping young people recognize identity is received from God, not discovered within ourselves, and helping them realize, well, that is such good news for all of us. The theme of the goodness of creation, that the physical world is good, that our bodies are good, helping young people realize our bodies are a gift from God and they're part of our true self. Our bodies aren't a container in which our true selves reside. We are a body. Our bodies are fundamental to who we are, a good gift from God that speaks to us about who we are. I think also teaching young people to have what I've kind of termed a suspicion of feelings. Just that thing of the biblical worldview of not everything we feel or everything we desire is true or good. In a sense, our feelings and desires can and do lie to us. And actually, we've got to take them to God's word and kind of wrestle with, should we embrace these? Is it good for us to embrace these? So if a young person begins to feel uncomfortable in their gender, their feelings that are very genuine, and we can express that as a genuine experience, but actually we have to always be suspicious about our internal experiences of, is it good? Is it true? What does God's word say? And finally, radical discipleship. The fact that for all of us, following Jesus means denying ourselves, including denying deeply felt desires and deeply felt feelings. That it's not peculiar for some of us, that is actually denying a sense that we might feel ourselves inside to be someone different to whom God in our body says we are. And also radical discipleship in the sense that following Jesus means sticking out. It means not going with the flow. It means sometimes we'll be misunderstood, actually sometimes even disliked. And any young person who's going to hold on to biblical truth and the good news of the Bible on a topic like this is going to experience the fact that that might well be a reality for them. And so we need to help equip them with an understanding of radical discipleship so that they're ready to do that. Those, I hope, are some initial practical kind of thoughts and some steps we can take. All of this, I know, is literally only scratching the surface of what is a huge, complicated, contested topic. I hope though that some basic kind of understanding and wrestling with those big questions and some initial ideas of what we can do in practical terms is a helpful start. Certainly we can unpack that now in Q&A, and the further resources on the handout that was sent through as well will be ways to further explore this. So I'm going to hand back to Andy for our Q&A.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Andrew. Just for those who arrived a little bit late, if you want a summary of what Andrew said, the handout is in the chat. There's a link to that in the chat. We're going to go for questions. Again, if you want to submit questions, go to Slido and LO webinar. And again, that link is in the chat as well. You can also look at the questions that have come in and vote some up, because we're probably not going to get through all of them. So I will work from the top in terms of the most popular. So Andrew, you happy for me to throw some questions at you? So let's go for the most popular ones so far. So what's your view on praying for people, for God's intervention in the way they feel about themselves? That might be tagged conversion therapy by some people. What's the benefit of praying for people in that situation?
Yeah, really great and really important question. Yeah. Conversion therapy is one of the things that makes it very complicated, isn't it? So you're probably aware the government working towards a legal ban of conversion therapy, and the question of whether or not transgender and gender identity should be included in that is hugely controversial, including lots of secular groups saying if we say that it's illegal to help a young person reconcile to their body, that is deeply unhelpful and deeply unwise. And so one thing to say is, would it be tagged conversion therapy? Depends who you ask, but even lots of secular people with not the worldview we have would be saying it certainly shouldn't be considered conversion therapy. I think my instinct would be more to want to help a young person, pray for a young person to have the wisdom and strength and grace needed to navigate their experience. I think that's a maybe more helpful thing. I don't know yet if I would pray directly for a significant change the way someone's feeling. My focus would be more on the how do we navigate this, with a recognition that actually the likelihood is over time this will abate, it will naturally go away. Certainly if it occurs pre-puberty, we know all the stats show it's vastly likely to go away as they go through puberty. We don't have the data yet really for on teenage onset gender questioning, but the likelihood is it would go away, especially the other things I've addressed. So I'm more likely probably to put my prayers more on the focus of God helping a young person to navigate this, to work out what's going inside of them, to handle distress and stuff, than I am for a direct change, which maybe is me being too sheepish and concerned about legislation and stuff coming. But I personally think would start from that position at the moment.
Great, thanks, Andrew. You may not know the answer to this one. You mentioned possible changes coming down the line in terms of NHS guidance. Does that apply to Scotland as well as England, do you know, or is that not sure?
Really good, really good. That's really helpful to clarify. No, sadly. The CAS review is NHS England and Wales specifically, and the new proposals are NHS England and Wales. Scotland thus far have been very clear they're not going to do their own review, and they've basically said the CAS review is irrelevant to them, which is quite hard to believe can be true. Whether that will change, what's going on politically in Scotland, is kind of up for debate, up for question. And certainly, well, a thing to pray for Scotland, whether it's Scotland or not, is that they do pay good attention to what's happening down here. And it should be said in places like Finland, I think we're Sweden and France as well, rolling back on stuff a lot as well, that they do realise that it is relevant to them. They do their own review of the Sandefjord Clinic, it's called, up there. And things also, and I was in Scotland recently, is encouraging people like teachers to highlight what is happening down here to their senior leadership teams, to highlight some of the alternative schools materials and stuff, because even if official policy isn't changing yet in Scotland, we can still have good influences at levels like schools and stuff like that. So as of yet, no, NHS Scotland aren't saying they're going to change much. I don't think they'll be able to last not changing much when it's so significant change down here. And as Scottish politics has its shake up as it's happening, that may change.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Let me ask a question that's come up in a variety of different forms. So how do churches build better community, being welcoming, where we can talk about anything without that becoming a kind of theological free-for-all? Or to put it another way, how can we practically and positively build community where all are welcomed, but not everything is encouraged and promoted? So how do you do the welcoming without affirming anything that people will think?
Yeah, which is tricky in a culture where people assume a lot about our views and assume you can't truly welcome and love them and not agree with what they think, because that makes it very complex for us. I do just always think, how do we avoid the theological problems? It is the gospel. Actually, it's being so clear on the gospel, communicating so clearly, embodying it so clearly, or that thing of so many young people come to us with the assumption of the gospel is, oh yeah, there's a certain number of ways and certain ways in which God wants me to sort my life out, and then he might love me and accept me. Because the glorious truth of the gospel is none of us can sort any of ourselves out, but we get accepted as we are. We get received by Jesus if we choose to respond to him. And then from that, he, through his spirit, helps us to sort out the things in our life. And so actually having a thoroughly gospel-shaped and gospel-saturated community is what allows churches and youth groups to become those kind of places where everyone gets to be honest, everyone gets to come and be welcomed and experience that. But actually not receiving the message of we don't need to change. And so maybe it's that, maybe it's having a high recognition in our youth groups, and especially that I guess means the teaching content or the discussion content that actually following Jesus makes big demands on us, and that every area of our life gets impacted by following Jesus. And that's really key. It's not that Jesus is obsessed with things like gender and sex, it's that every area of our life actually gets impacted by following Jesus. But also the recognition of that flows from following Jesus. And if you're not a follower of Jesus yet, then just not convinced he particularly expects you to live his way. How we do that in really practical terms on the ground, I'm not going to claim I've got great experience of that or I'm hugely certain, but those I think are the foundations that allow us to do it. And then the whole thing of young people struggle to believe we love them if we don't affirm everything they believe. I think we basically can't do that through thinking, you've got to do it through experience. For a young person to experience, this person really loves me, even though they hold these abhorrent views about trans people, as they might put it. And so actually it's being the kind of youth leaders, church leaders who talk to young people and remember things about their lives, and, are asking the week later, well, how did that exam go? Or how was that performance? And even where possible, turning up to the drama performance or sport game, whatever it is every now and then, and just being someone who is so demonstrably, so in action, demonstrating love to this young person, then actually they're just left baffled by how can you so love me while holding these horrible views? Because that becomes an experience of the love of Jesus and kind of an opening of maybe there's something more here, maybe I need to kind of explore this. So it is really tricky, I think, to do, and a challenge every church and youth group is wrestling with, but those would be some starting thoughts that might help us.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And another question where it may well be starting thoughts rather than a sort of dogmatic principle for every church everywhere, but what should we do if a transgender young person comes along to a church youth group? Also practical questions, toilets and so on. Any wisdom on handling some of those practical questions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get some starting points. I do think churches need to think about this seriously, and you probably do need a written policy, as in you need to work out how you're doing this in a way which adheres to the Equality Act, in a way which ensures safeguarding, and is generally caring for loving young people, and just having a policy is going to help everyone do that. And hopefully it doesn't happen, but if any allegations are then brought against you about your treatment with a trans person, you've got something written down to appeal to. What do we do? I think basically two things. One, I think that the first priority is safeguarding. So that does mean safeguarding single-sex spaces and single-sex spaces, which the Equality Act gives us every right to do. So toilets and such like kept for use by people of the biological sex they're designed for. The very next priority then becomes, how do we then best care for a young person who would feel uncomfortable in that context, so comfortable in a single-sex environment? So you've got, say, a teenage boy identifying as a girl, wants to use the girls' toilets, but your policy says he can't, but he doesn't feel comfortable using the boys' toilets. What do you do? Ideally, basically, you want to have a gender-neutral toilet or something available to that young person. It's always this thing of, we have immovable lines for safeguarding, and which particularly basically is the protection of young women. And then we have the second line of, how do we, within those immovable lines, do everything we can to help a young person feel the most comfortable they can? So the classic one that comes up is around sleeping arrangements in residentials. And again, I think immovable lines on single-sex spaces, but then it's a conversation with the young person they're parent of. There's various options here. It could be actually you do go in at a tent or whatever it would be with people of your biological sex, and we can talk about who you'd be most comfortable sharing with. And actually, if you choose to do that, we're going to link you up with a youth leader. And if anything happens in the week, if anyone's making fun of you or making you feel uncomfortable or anything, you have someone you know immediately, that's the person you can talk to, and they're there to look out for you. And so the young person is thinking, you're being really horrible, we're not letting me sleep in the group I want to sleep with, but you are doing everything you can, it seems, to love me and care for me. And so always those two steps of hard lines for safeguarding, then how do we best love trans-identifying young people within it, I think is the way to go.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. And just a question on pronouns. So again, somebody wanting to use a different pronoun, should we use the pronoun, and any wisdom on that within youth groups?
Yeah, and this is complicated by our kind of positioning as youth leaders and church leaders rather than parents. The general answer in terms of teens, I think there's now good reason to say we don't rush to use pronouns your person wants us to. And this again is what the NHS guidance space is pointing to. What the CAS review has said is that even social intervention, such as pronoun changing, is, what's the language, is a significant psychosocial intervention. It really does something, basically. It's not a minor thing, is what they're saying. And there is increasing evidence that even social transition, so nothing medical, just names, where you dress and stuff, even that makes it less likely that a young person will naturally grow out of this experience, which arguably is the best outcome in the sense of it avoids potentially lifelong invasive medical procedures that can have some rather nasty side effects. Therefore, as adults who want to safeguard young people, it seems that the best thing actually is for us not to encourage or facilitate social transition that might make it less likely they're able to grow more comfortable with their bodies. And that, I think, basically kind of what the NHS is saying they're going to move towards, and why they're saying it's only in these cases of significant distress or impairment of social functioning that they will encourage or allow kind of social transition. So if I'm talking to a parent, I'm going to push quite hard on, I think this is one of those difficult parent decisions where you have to make the decision to do what your child isn't happy with, but it's in their best long-term interest. I think the evidence is there to suggest that. For us as youth leaders, church leaders, if a parent is taking that route, I think that's quite easy. I think then we also don't use the pronoun, both in recognition of respect for the parent's choice, but also what's best for the young person. The really difficult one is the parent is not interested or very, that's unfair, sorry, is very happy to use the chosen pronoun. We might not feel so comfortable to do so. In that circumstance, I'm probably just going to avoid using pronouns. We're lucky that in the English language, our second person pronouns, the word you isn't gendered, it's not a big deal. You don't tend to use gendered pronouns talking in someone's presence, so it's fine. You can use their name instead, or I'm probably more open to using a gender neutral pronoun than I am a pronoun for the opposite sex. So it's quite complex and difficult for us in those kind of positions of not being the parents, but being involved in a young person's life. But those are the considerations I want to have in mind.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. You've mentioned the sort of distress perspective as a useful lens for us to see this through. Are you suggesting that that will be the case for some, most, all of cases? Will there be those who experience gender dysphoria for life? And how do we know the difference?
Really, really great question, yeah. I think it's probably true the majority of cases we're seeing now, particularly teenage onset, when a teenager doesn't have a childhood experience of gender questioning, but it emerges in teenage years, because that's just very different to what's ever much been seen before. The two times in life when gender questioning appears are childhood or late 20s onwards, normally, historically, until the last kind of 10 years. I think the majority of young people, the distress perspective explains what's happening. Before 10 years ago, there were two recognized forms of gender dysphoria, one of which is highly effeminate same-sex attracted men who might experience those feelings for life. And the other is adults who basically are sexually attracted to the idea of themselves as a woman. It's men, it's called autogynephilia, which isn't so relevant to our conversation. All of which I say, for a very small number, these feelings might well persist into adulthood and be a real battle and quite consistent and extreme or life impacting through life. That is a small minority. And interestingly, some research I was reading just this week actually suggesting that even maybe the distress perspective might even explain those situations anyway. But on the whole, if left to run its course, and that's what these new NHS guidance is particularly pointing out, and the fact we don't want to intervene to reaffirm anything unhelpfully, if left to run its course, most people will find this does naturally abate as they go into adulthood, but there will be small numbers for whom it's longer term. That's very waffly, sorry. I think that just about got to the answer in the end.
That's fine. That's helpful. Any thoughts on books, resources that youth teams could use, or even that would be helpful for young people themselves?
There's not much, sadly. The best, well, I think one of the best books for teenagers, which only has a chapter on this, is Preston Sprinkle's Living in a Grey World. Preston Sprinkle, brilliant American author, and it's kind of his teenage version of his bigger book, People to Be Loved. So it's mostly about sexuality, but does have a good chapter in there on trans and related matters. In terms of things actually for teenagers, I will say my own book, because I don't think there are many options, and it does apparently work for teenagers, Finding Your Best Identity. The reason being, A, it's short and hopefully accessible, so I've tried to write it so that older teens can read it, but also the main focus is on identity. And I'm just not convinced that explaining this distress perspective to young people is the right way to go. I think in a sense, we need to be equipped by that to pastor and disciple and parent and whatever well with that knowledge. I think most young people would immediately switch off if they hear us say it and not listen to anything else we've got to say. So I think the distress perspective is helpful for us to know, to understand what's going on, to how we pastor. What I think my book's therefore helpful for young people is the focus on identity. And I think identity is one of those themes. There's a really good in on this actually to help young people wrestle with this. And just that thing of, are your internal feelings really a good basis for your identity? And there's just good reasons to say they're definitely not. And certainly as a Christian, that's not a biblical way of doing it. And that's what my book kind of attempts to do. But to be honest, there's just a huge gap in the market of a need for good resources. Two secular books. There's a picture book for kind of young kids, I guess kind of just preschool or early school years, called My Body Is Me, which I think is fairly helpful. Not much in there that would be problematic to us as Christians. And the one for slightly older kids, kind of for tweens, which I think is just called Sex and Gender. We'll look it up and we'll put it in the email, which is kind of meant to be like a graphic novel style explanation, of sex and gender, the impact of gender stereotypes and stuff. Both, I think, published by Transgender Trend and quite helpful. We can certainly send out links to those.
And in terms of books on trans questions more broadly, Preston Sprinkle's book Embodied, I guess, is that where you would be sending people? Yeah,
Preston Sprinkle's Embodied is certainly the best single volume treatment for this. It's fairly thick, but accessible, very thorough. He has a chapter specifically on this. I know he'd like to update that if he was able to. It's kind of a fast moving conversation, but there is good stuff in there. Andrew Walker's book, God and the Transgender Debate, second edition was published last year, has a good chapter on speaking to children. I just think takes a good approach to this, an approach which could work potentially, actually, I think, with young people. And for, again, thinking more broadly on trans, my little booklet, People Not Pronouns, gives, where I've tried to give a kind of a rounded Christian approach, and particularly looking at the themes of identity, themes of suffering, and how they might help us to think about this, which links in with some of what I've said today as well.
Sorry, I should have mentioned your booklet before Preston Sprinkle's Embodied, but there we go. So good stuff. I think we're probably running out of time in terms of questions, but yeah, thank you for all of those that have come in. Just whilst we've got Andrew here, I thought it'd be useful to mention very briefly one or two other resources that we're working on as living out. So Andrew, you've got the most ridiculous title in Christendom. You are the Emerging Generations Director. Do you want to tell us what one of those is, and how in a sense being the Emerging Generations Director helps us as we seek to encourage young people in this sort of area?
I think it's the most jazzy title in all of Christendom. That's what I'm hoping. So basically my role on the team is to help make sure that Living Out is engaging with under 25s and those who are serving them. So kids, youth and students, and kind of kids workers, parents, youth workers and student workers, just so aware that these topics of gender, sexuality, identity are so prominent among young people. Different things we're doing to do that, but two things I'll highlight. One is we've recently added a youth leaders area to our website. So at the kind of top navigation menu of our website, a youth leaders area there, which has various things, including some collections of resources specifically handpicked for youth leaders. And then the big thing we've launched just recently this year is the Youth Leader Network, which is a way of helping us be connected to and youth leaders be connected to us. And our hope is to equip youth leaders on questions of faith and sexuality. So if you sign up at the link there or on the QR code, You get regular updates from us in both email and video format, which are pointing to events and resources, both Living Out resources and more broadly as well, which we think will be helpful to you. We're also inviting network members to submit questions to us so we can discuss those in some short videos we produce each time we do we release an update, just so it gives some thoughts and wisdom, hopefully, on the questions that you have, the young people you're serving have. And our hope is that over coming months and years, the network will kind of grow to allow us to do other things as well. But it's a great way of anyone working with teenagers and young people of keeping connected up to us and being resourced. So livingout.org/youth-leaders is the place to go for that.
Brilliant, thanks, Andrew. Just wanted to other things to mention that we've got coming up. So we've got coming up in London on the 17th of June, a joint conference that we're running with our friends at True Freedom Trust called The Family of God, the Church's Home for Same-Sex Attracted Christians. And we've had two audiences in mind as we've put that together. We want it to be an encouragement to those who do experience same-sex attraction, to seek help, to seek support, to seek fellowship within the church. But we've also set it up in such a way that we hope it will be useful for church leaders as well, as to how they can encourage and care for those who experience same-sex attraction within their church families. So we look in Ephesians together. We've got a choice of seminars. I think Andrew's doing one of the seminars there. So if in a sense, as a church leader, it'd be useful to hear from the experience of same-sex attracted Christians, that's 17th of June, joint conference in London. And again, details you can find on the Living Out website or the True Freedom Trust website under events. If you want to know what Living Out is doing, then you can sign up for our newsletter. That will once a month give you details of new articles, new blogs on the website, new videos or stories that we've put together, and events that are coming up. We do around 9 or 10 Living Out days around the country, and it might be a useful way of finding out whether we're coming anywhere near you. So once a month there's a newsletter, so do feel free to sign up for that. If as a church you'd be interested in supporting Living Out financially, perhaps as part of your mission budget, we'd obviously be very positive about that. We obviously rely on donations to keep going. So again, livingout.org/give would give you details of that. And then lastly, this is the second of the webinars that we've done. We did one last term. I think our plan is to do one a term on different issues related to sexuality and gender. We're looking for topics that will serve you, essentially. So if there's a particular question in this area, it might be how do we teach on sexuality, might be issues of pastoral care, might be how we engage culturally. Please do let us know on the feedback forms as to what would be useful topics to consider. I think a feedback form should come to you by email possibly, but equally do get in touch with us via LO-webinar. Thank you so much. I used to be a church leader, so I know how much pressure there is in terms of time. So thank you so much for coming for this hour. So Andrew, thank you as ever very much. As I say, do get in touch if there's any way we can help in the future. Thanks so much for joining us.